Welcome to Smart Talk, where we speak with leading academics and other thoughtful persons on the important challenges facing the world today. My name is Edward Dodson. I am a longtime member of the faculty of the Henry George School of Social Science. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with John Muellbauer, a senior research fellow and professor of economics at Nuffield College at the University of Oxford. He is also a senior fellow of the Institute of New Economic Thinking at the Oxford Martin School at the university. Professor Muellbauer is an expert on how the systems of banking, credit, and finance affect the productive output in countries as diverse as the United Kingdom, the United States, France, and South Africa. In a recent online post, he took aim at what is happening to the British economy because of skyrocketing increases in the price of residential housing. He wrote this: high prices of houses and land have distorted the British economy and impeded productivity growth, creating widening inequality and despair for younger generations. Professor Muellbauer proposes a two-part solution: revision of the existing council tax and a land value tax on the most expensive land, including unoccupied land. In a recent working paper titled Land, Housing, and the British Economy, which will be the basis for our discussion, he says the consequences of the long period of flawed government policies where land ownership is concerned, where land use and taxation are also involved, is a real problem. These have led high government officials to be very inappropriately influenced by the economics of the neoclassical and new Keynesian proponents. As he writes, I became convinced that the economics profession had vastly underestimated the influential role of housing and credit in the macroeconomy and regions. And he then adds this: we probably have the most regressive annual property tax in the world. Well, Professor Muellbauer, with that introduction, welcome to Smart Talk. Your recent paper, from which I have just quoted, paints a pretty dismal picture of politics, public policy, and the living conditions of a large segment of the UK population, going back, I guess, to at least Margaret Thatcher and her
Yeah.
regime. So my first question to you is, how much blame is rightfully shared by the members of the economics discipline?
Well, I think a lot. Back in the day, Mervyn King, who later became governor of the Bank of England, used to regularly invite me to lunch at the Bank of England. And he put forward the view that asset prices and the prices of housing and land in particular were a complete sideshow. They had no functional role in the economy. Their fluctuations simply reflected shifts in expectations. And therefore, one didn't need to worry about that part of the economy. I mean, that attitude, which I suspect that the king no longer believes in, kind of reflected the discipline. So I started, thinking about these things way back. I think probably in the 1970s, when I first had personal experience of a really ferocious speculative boom in the London housing market. And I was trying to get into that market as a very young and naive economics lecturer. And, you know, I had a lucky escape. I managed not to buy. And shortly after I managed not to buy, the oil shock arrived and prices in real terms fell by 35% or something like that. So that was the first of these post-war housing booms in the UK, repeated on a bigger scale, a more long-term scale in the 1980s under Mrs. Thatcher. That led to quite a serious crisis in the early 90s. We had the highest rates of foreclosures and mortgage payment defaults that we've ever had. And then we had another bit of the cycle in the obviously in the 2000s. Fortunately, because in the UK we have floating rate mortgages, when the bank reduced interest rates, that stabilized the economy, you know,
Can I
in
ask
a
a
rather
question
quicker
there?
way. Yeah.
Uh, was the majority of the lending done in the UK adjustable rate, or were fixed rate loans still available generally?
Well, at the moment, we have a mix of floating and relatively short-term fixes. So there are very few mortgages with a fixed rate term longer than 5 years. Um, in the fixed rate market, they're mostly 2 or 3 years.
That's
Um,
interesting. Only because here, as you may know,
yeah,
after
as you know.
2008, the main purchasers of residential mortgage loans, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, were both taken over by the government. And up until the crash of 2008, the general trend was for more and more adjustable rate mortgages to be approved, but there was still quite a large activity of fixed rate loans being pulled into mortgage-backed securities, and there was quite a large market for them. What happened here, unfortunately, was the introduction of the subprime mortgage business. Now, I wondered to what extent the subprime business affected what was going on in the UK.
We had a much less serious wave of subprime in the UK. We did have some in the period sort of 2004 to 2007. The quality of lending did deteriorate quite a lot. Particularly, there were new entrants, some of them American and other foreign banks into that market. And the credit screening that was being done at the time was not very satisfactory. But it was nowhere near the scale of bad loans and poor lending of the US.
Were your colleagues in the discipline paying attention to this, or were you an outlier? Was this something you're trying to, you know, kind of make known, but no one was listening? Were you the proverbial voice in the wilderness?
Well, look, I mean, there are other economists who one of them is my great friend John Duca, who was at the Federal Reserve in Dallas, is now a professor at Oberlin College. He understands the US credit market extremely well. And when we joined forces back in the early 2000s, I think we shared an understanding of how important these credit cycles are and how they interact and how they influence the economy. And there are other people I could mention who at least had some inkling of the dangers of these phenomena.
And that brings up the obvious question is the policymakers. They don't seem to have ever spent time listening to this message or taking it sufficiently serious to gauge the macroeconomic implications that you've outlined in your paper.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I would say that since the global financial crisis, the what's called the macroprudential framework, particularly in Europe and under the influence of the IMF, has really developed, in a very dramatic fashion. It's now much more inclusive, much more rigorous. There's a lot of research that goes on macroprudential policy that tries to forestall these unfortunate booms that can occur when lending standards deteriorate too much.
What's the current thinking now in terms of potentially re-regulating the financial services sector in the UK? I mean, we're still struggling here in the United States with the outcomes of the long, continuous process of deregulation. Just to give you an example of how that affected my work, when I started working at Fannie Mae at the end of 1984, 80% of our business volume was done with about 300 different financial entities, commercial banks, savings banks, mortgage bankers, etc. When I retired in 2005, 80% of our business was done by 8 entities. And One of those was foreign domicile. That's HSBC. It was quite a remarkable change in the whole, sector of the economy and that concentration. And I think most of us here uh, believe that that concentration has been one of the major problems that we've had to deal with, since the 2008 crash. Has the situation been at all similar in the UK from your analysis?
Yeah, well, one question concerns the mutual societies, the building societies, as we call them over here, um, who back in 1979 had something like a 95% market share. Their market share is now 29%. It's actually been rising in recent years. There were many mutual societies of this sort, and in the demutualization that took place in the 1980s, many of them merged and disappeared, and now they are, as I think I said, they now account for 29% of the mortgage market. So, I mean, that is one aspect of the concentration. So the banks are pretty concentrated. We have half a dozen very large banks that dominate the banking part of mortgage provision. But still, there are smaller building societies out there still doing good work and with a greater care for their customers than many of the big banks.
Are they locally chartered by local communities and cities, or how do they obtain their charters?
They um, the smaller ones tend to be quite localized to particular parts of the country. Um, the biggest of the building societies is called the Nationwide. As the name indicates, it has, in fact, as long ago as the 1980s, the Nationwide was even then one of the biggest of the building societies with a national franchise. It had developed from a regional lender, but became national over many years. So yeah, we don't have the kind of regional banking regulation that you have in the US. We have national regulations, and so the charters are not particularly linked to localities. It's simply the business model is linked to the localities.
Okay. The reason I asked that in particular was because one result of our deregulation was authorizing the savings institutions and our commercial banks to begin doing business across state lines and also being able to merge. And the result here with regard to the savings associations was, just a dramatic loss of deposit base. And part of that was caused by the proliferation of the money market mutual funds. And I wondered if that was also a contributing factor to the loss of deposits by your savings societies.
Not particularly. I mean,
Hmm.
it was a deliberate act of deregulation by the Thatcher administration in the 1980s. They were very keen to expand mortgage lending. They were very keen on this notion of the property owning democracy, that they wanted
Yes.
to promote property ownership. They wanted to boost house prices, actually. Um, and so they eliminated the credit controls that in the 1970s had prevented the big commercial banks from entering the mortgage market. And so when the big commercial banks went into that market, then of course building societies demanded similar deregulation.
Mhm.
So that's what happened in the 1980s. I mean, that really set the tone for this big revolution.
And I recall that you wrote that they then expanded outside of their normal business model and
They
had
did.
led to some unfortunate experiences of chasing yield without really understanding how to protect the risk.
Exactly. They did lots of things that they had no previous experience of, and and as a result, I think none of the building societies that demutualized in the 1980s or the early 90s is still trading under its name. Have all been absorbed by other institutions.
So let's talk a little bit about economics.
Yeah.
You are very critical of the council tax. We in the United States, we have no understanding of what the council tax is. I've read your history of it. Quite frankly, it doesn't make sense to me as a public policy that would fly. And yet it has been I guess, the albatross around the the market there. So would you give us a little background on that and your observations about the council tax?
Well, it all started with Mrs. Thatcher because Mrs. Thatcher, as part of promoting home ownership, wanted to eliminate property taxes completely.
Yeah.
And so she said, well, let's have a poll tax where everybody pays the same, whether they're a billionaire or a garbage collector, um, which is a pretty stupid idea. And it cost her her political career. It was so incredibly unpopular, as it, of course, it should be, that she was forced to resign in 1990. Um, and
Who
then
was her
the
primary advisor at the time that put forward that idea?
well, there were some very right-wing libertarian politicians who thought this was a good idea. Um, anyway, so the Major John Major became the Tory Prime Minister, and in haste they wanted to replace this poll tax that wasn't collecting much revenue. There had been riots and payment refusals and so on across the country with something. And so they cobbled together something quick, which they thought, in a few years' time we'll fix it properly. But it was the council tax. And unfortunately, the council tax has remained on the statute books. And the council tax preserves some of the key features of the poll tax, which is that it's incredibly regressive. So there's a limit, a top limit on how much tax is paid. So if you live in a 50 million pound house, you pay exactly the same as someone in a 2 million pound house. Um, and you pay very little more than someone in a £250,000 house. Um, so it's deliberately regressive. There's a ceiling at the top. It's regionally regressive because the poorer regions, having less tax revenue, have to have higher rates of tax. And so a poorer person living in one of the poorer regions pays much more in tax, even in nominal terms, apart from as a fraction of value, than a wealthy person living in an affluent part of London.
So my follow-up question then on British tax law would
Yeah.
be, common sense would suggest to me that then the corresponding policy would be a high gain tax on the gains on the sale of real estate, but then that would be a disincentive for people to actually put their property on the market. Is that a fair conclusion or not?
I think that's absolutely right. I think economists who look at potential types of tax on property think that capital gains tax is a huge impediment to transactions and may even be counterproductive in the sense that it locks up much of the market and prevents trading. Um,
And what is the actual rate on gains on the sale of assets, real estate assets in the UK?
well, if you're a if it's your primary residence, it's zero.
Oh
There's
my.
no capital gains tax on your primary residence. Um, Otherwise, it's 28%, I think, is the capital gains tax rate. So if you're a landlord and you rent out some property and you sell the property at some point, you pay 28% capital gains tax.
Ours is a bit more complicated than that. It depends on what you then purchase. and the value of your
Yeah,
subsequent purchase. So
yeah,
you may end
yeah,
up paying a significant capital gains tax if you're downsizing, for example.
yeah.
And that's that. I was looking at demographics and population changes and household formation, and you cover some of that in your paper. And I just wondered if your conclusion is that the changing demographics of the British population, the reduction in number of children per household, and the delay in marriage and the formation of new adult households, how that impacts the overall market and how that makes its way through the macro economy given current economic policies.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And in this context, I have to explain to you that we also have um, incredibly high transactions taxes. So we have the combination of these highly regressive and stupid annual property tax and a transactions tax, which for second homes, the top marginal rate is 17%. So imagine you've got a £3 million house. Um, the transactions tax on that is going to be the order of, well, marginal rate of 17% translates into an average rate of about 15% for a £3 million house. That's a lot of money to pay. And this has a very negative effect, of course, on mobility and the ability of people to choose to downsize or to move or to live near their children or to work near or to live near a place of work that's desirable. So it has very negative consequences on the efficiency of the economy and on the mobility of the economy, the ability of the economy to respond to structural changes. So we have the worst of both worlds. We have a very inequitable annual property tax and a very economically inefficient transactions tax. And that has quite a big impact on demographics because, if you think about downsizing, there are very big, constraints on downsizing because of these high transactions taxes.
Yeah, I want to get into a good discussion of the property tax and the potential impact of moving to a split rate property tax, as you've written, or land value taxation, as we refer to it here in the United States. Um, but based on just the comments you've made now, um, I'm reminded of an article by several economists here in the United States who were examining labor mobility in metropolitan New York City. And they made the argument that the low rate of home ownership in New York City um, was actually a great advantage for that market because it made it very easy for people who lose employment to move because they're renters. They can break their lease and there's pent-up demand for rental housing. So I wonder if you know I wonder what your sense is with regard to the demographics of the fact that so many younger adults cannot afford at all to get into the home ownership market. Are young adults living at home with parents much longer? Are they not
Oh,
moving
absolutely.
out, not establishing even new households in a rental capacity?
Both of those statements are true. The owner occupation rate has for young households is something like half of what it was 25 years ago. Um, and the rental market, particularly in places, in the most buoyant places, London, some of the other cities where employment opportunities are very good, um, very, very high rents. Um, and the problem is, I mean, our situation is worse than yours. So since 2007, living standards for the mass of the population have essentially not increased.
Hmm.
Um, and so, and interest rates, of course, have been very low for much of that period. So, for a young person to enter the market, um, they need to save. The rates of return on saving products are low, so it's hard to save. Incomes haven't gone up in real terms, and so whereas house prices have relative to incomes, at all-time highs. So no wonder it's so difficult for young people in the UK, those without the bank of mum and dad or grandparents behind them. And as I pointed out in that article, there is a widespread despair among young people. And of course, that some of that translates politically into support for weird populist movements.
What about the impact then of Brexit? Has pulling away from the European Union, which I gather was politically supported, now been thought of as not perhaps the best path that Britain should have taken?
Yes, well, the vote was 52-48, so it was
Yeah,
a pretty close run thing.
yeah.
And the vote was based on a mixture of protest and misinformation. There was a large element of a protest vote, particularly from the left behind people in the left behind regions where incomes had done even less well than in the south and in London. Public policy since Thatcher has really neglected regional inequality. There was deindustrialization was a massive thing in the Thatcher years of the 1980s, and there was very little help provided to the communities where deindustrialization occurred. And I think the long-term resentment of people living in those places against the central government was a major reason for this Brexit vote. Brexit, of course, has been a big mistake. At the very least, our national income is 4% lower. Some estimates suggest it's 8% lower. Somewhere between 4 and 8%, I think most economists would agree, has been the cost. And um, since since the financial crisis, we've also had governments very keen on what's called austerity,
Yes.
worrying tremendously about public debt and about spending and cutting back on public services. So there's been huge underinvestment in infrastructure, in the health service, in human capital, and so on. And all of that has left the economy really in a very bad state. And there are so many pressures on spending that it's very hard for any government to try to fix this.
Well, the background for that question was now that you have pulled away from the European Union
Yeah.
and you yourself are proposing significant reforms in the tax regime, does this not give Britain more um, uh, greater ability to act independently now? I mean, the idea of imposing a national land value tax that might not have been possible previously, but now that the nation is pulled away from the European Union, does this open up a door for a political possibility of actually doing the right thing?
No, actually, actually, within the European Union, there are huge variations in property tax systems, from Denmark to Italy to Greece. Um, each country has its own systems. Um,
So it's
so
irrelevant that
it's completely irrelevant. Yeah,
so let's
sorry.
talk about the property tax in Britain and what you would like to see, happen. Um, we can get into a little bit of the economics. People who are listening to this probably know they're familiar with Henry George's analysis and the whole concept of the public capture of economic rents, will lead to a much more stable economy and a fairer outcome in terms of wealth distribution. But the implementation of this idea has always been and everywhere it's been tried, difficult technically, and the question is, are we ready for a nationwide application of this? In the United States, it's community by community. We,
Yeah.
so you have, thousands and thousands of communities looking to property values for their tax revenue. So, for example, I live in a small town outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so we have a property tax with separate rates of taxation imposed by the town, by the township, by the county, and by the school district. So there's four taxing bodies, each of which imposes a rate of taxation to balance their budget based on the financial needs that they have and based on the assessed values that are determined at the county level. From reading, your paper, it seems to me the history of Britain has been in part an assessment problem. So I wonder if that seems to be technically solvable and how much impact that would have on the implementation of the split rate tax in Britain.
Yeah, I'll come to that specifically in a moment, but let me just roll back on one point, which is that the US has a zoning system for allocation of land. We have a planning system which is highly interventionist and much more restrictive and much more cumbersome than the US system. As a result, there are fantastic differences in land values for land under different types of permission. Much more extreme differences than I think you'd find almost anywhere in the US. So that's part of the background when one thinks about taxing land values. It's the nature of those permissions
And that is traced back to the labor government that came into power after the Second World War, correct?
it does, yeah, yeah. Um, okay, so is it an assessment problem? I don't think the technical problems are very serious. Um, I mean, these days, the mass valuation models for the hedonics of housing and land work really surprisingly well. Um, in fact, the private sector, both in the US and the UK, has makes very widespread use of hedonic models where the essentially you compare the prices of similar properties. You look at the history of the last few years of sales prices in that location for similar properties. On that basis, you can work out what the value of a property is. Now, a refinement of that approach, which takes into account not just the characteristics of the building, but also of the land on which it sits and the type of land on which it sits, can separate pretty well the different valuations for the land component and the building component. So I think the assessment difficulty is often put forward as a reason for not thinking of this, but actually the technical problems can be overcome. Currently, I think in Germany, the the Germans have gone through a national revaluation in which quite explicitly buildings and land are being separately valued. And in Baden-Württemberg, I believe the state government is putting the tax entirely on the land component as opposed to the building component. And different states in Germany can choose, how much to put on each of the two components. So the fact that, if the Germans can do it, there's no reason why it should be technically impossible to do it in other countries. And of course, there's experience in Denmark and Australia and so on of from these kinds of valuation exercises.
Well, there are members of the Henry George community in the UK who are working on those issues as well. You may be familiar with some of their work. But
Yeah.
uh, one of the things that I teach, obviously, at the Henry George School, I've taught political economy. And because of my background, I tend to spend a lot of time on the real estate market and the economics of real estate. And one of the challenges that people have is grasping the whole idea of capitalization of income streams.
Yeah.
And and when it comes to imposing a land value tax, if if we do impose a high enough annual tax on the value of land, we eventually run into a problem that land prices are going to fall and perhaps fall significantly,
Yeah.
theoretically, potentially to zero. So this is where the challenge in dealing with assessors uh, on the technical side comes into play is how do we get assessment people to gradually begin to capture the data that captures the potential annual rental value of locations versus its stated capitalized selling price. I mean, 100% tax on a $1 selling price is not going to raise much revenue. So, do you see that as as something that can be relatively easy to overcome by educating the people who are doing the work of assessment, or not?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. Um, I mean, personally, and based partly on theory and experience, the connection between rents and valuations is less perfect than you might think. Um, I mean, I know American
I know that
economists.
nothing that we're talking about is involving perfect. Uh,
Yeah,
in fact, the perfect is the enemy of the good in our
yeah, that's right.
situation.
My pragmatic approach is simply to go for tax market value and to collect to make sure that the database is as good as it could possibly be. So in the UK, for example, there are um, um, many options on particularly farmland, and these options are not publicly traded. Nevertheless, those option prices, if they were publicly available, would provide a huge amount of information on the basis of which one could make better policy and design better taxes. So, and in fact, another problem in the UK is that not all property is actually registered at the land registry. So there is some unregistered property that's been in private ownership for hundreds of years that's never been sold and doesn't show up in the database. So there are some underlying data problems that one needs to fix. And then I think we could largely rely on market value, even if market value is distorted. Still, you can tax market value, and you don't have to worry too much about what the underlying rent stream might be.
Well, I guess my response is let's hope that we face this issue sometime in the future because that would be an indication that we're beginning to significantly move in the right direction in terms of exempting property improvements from the tax base and relying on, economic rent or land value. So it's a problem that I hope we'll have technically.
Yeah,
Couple questions I have to you about the strategy of the central bank, the Bank of England.
yeah,
Certainly after the 2008 crash, the Bank of England did very much what the same thing the Federal Reserve did. It brought down interest rates so low that basically, if you're a saver, adjusted for inflation, you have a negative yield on your savings. And that was all really uh, designed to bring back the property markets. So, what is the current policy of the Bank of England? How do they assess the situation? And what is their strategy to try to find the right mix between inflation and recession?
Yeah, that's a tricky problem. Yeah, the in the UK we have a kind of flexible inflation targeting mandate. We don't have the explicit mandate the Federal Reserve has, which is employment combined with good employment combined with low inflation. Um, Nevertheless, the flexible inflation targeting framework that we have does pay quite a lot of attention to what happens in the real economy. So if the real economy is depressed, there is pressure on the Bank of England to go easy on interest rates. Um, yeah, so in terms of what should have happened, what happened after 2007, um, as I said, the in the UK with a largely floating rate market. So in 2007, 2008, 2009, the great majority of mortgages would have been floaters or very short-term fixes, like 2-year fixes. So that meant that bringing down interest rates had a dramatic effect on cash flows. It improved the cash flows of indebted individuals immediately, and that helped stabilize the economy quite sharply. That's a big contrast to the US because in the US you had mostly fixed rate mortgages. So the cuts in interest rates that the Federal Reserve brought in didn't immediately translate into lower tax bills, lower mortgage bills for people who are heavily in debt.
It
Um,
did generate a significant number of refinances, but it took time to make its way through the economy, a couple of years.
well, you had to have a lot of equity to be able to refinance, and a lot of homes in the US were in negative equity,
Yeah.
so couldn't refinance. Um, so that's one big contrast. Now, as a short-term response, I thought that was absolutely correct. Bringing down interest rates to very low levels to deal with that immediate post-crisis problem. But afterwards, I think the failure really was on the fiscal side.
Mhm.
If the fiscal authorities had got their act together and focused on promoting growth and employment, rather than worrying so much about the level of debt. When real interest rates are negative, uh, you don't worry too much about government debt. You can issue bonds at incredibly cheap rates and finance public investment very effectively. And public investment then brings back growth. But instead of doing that, they refrained. They cut spending across the board, including capital spending. That was the big mistake. If they hadn't done that, it would have been possible for the Bank of England to start raising rates somewhat earlier, and then we wouldn't have had quite as severe a property bubble as we've had in more recent years.
Well, neither of our countries seems to have taken advantage of the best economic advice that was available. I've monitoring the U.S. economy. One of my responsibilities in my working life was to do an annual update on the housing market in the northeastern part of the United States, bring in stakeholders, and we would have discussions about what was going on. So I looked at a great deal of appraisal data, and you referenced that a little bit earlier, getting access to the appraisals that were performed by actual real estate appraisers, and then aggregating that data to see what the trends were in different markets. And it was always interesting here in the United States that markets were very different neighborhood by neighborhood. And of course, one of my responsibilities was to help bring affordable housing into what we called underserved communities. And
Yeah,
I just wonder, have cities you're talking about you're talking about rural areas being underserved, London being the magnet for investment and therefore high property prices. And yet in London, there have to be neighborhoods that are underserved, and that has to do with demographics and perhaps their racial con you know population, new arrivals, immigrants, and all that. So I wonder, what your analysis has shown in terms of discrimination on the basis of race or ethnicity, et cetera, in terms of access to financing.
Yes, I think in the UK it's been less of an issue than it has in the US. Because in the US, the history of redlining
Yes.
goes back, well, back to the terrible old days, um, before the 60s. In the UK, we're a more multicultural, more outgoing society, more international migrants, a lot of people from the Indian subcontinent, from Europe. Um, I mean, the Irish at one time were a major part of the immigrant structure. And certainly there have been times in the past when racial discrimination against the Irish, for example, and later on against immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean, um, was an issue. Um, but in terms of the mortgage market, I would say much less so.
Well, that's
Um,
encouraging to hear,
yeah,
actually. I'm
yeah.
I'm I'm now reading a new book that just came out here in the United States on the history of the Community Reinvestment Act. The authors asked me to review it, and I'm just reading it, and it really does highlight the fact that we in the United States still have a very racially divided society, and the financial community hasn't done enough to overcome those, the discrimination that's occurred in those markets, and people were still adversely affected to this very day as we're speaking. And it's really a sad commentary on our uh, cultural norms, I guess is the way I would explain it. But it's encouraging to hear that that's not so much an issue in the UK.
It's a bit of an issue, but it's much less extreme
Yeah.
than it is in the US.
So, uh, land value taxation is part of the solution. It's not going to solve problems immediately. Um, when I'm asked by students, what are we headed for in 2026? Based on the data that I look at and that others in that I'm in contact with are providing, uh, it seems like we have peaked, that we're at the end of the current economic cycle, that some of the increasing delinquencies, foreclosures, delinquencies on automobile loans and installment credit, et cetera, is really telling us that we're ready to begin a recessionary contraction. And how serious that will be, no one seems to really know, but my own view is that it could be as bad or worse than 2008. And I wonder if, from what you're looking at in the UK and other data from countries other than the UK, if you have a similar conclusion, or what is your prognosis for the next year or so?
Yeah, I mean, you started by talking about land value taxes. Let me just mention something which I think is relevant, which is the case of Singapore. So in Singapore, the government owns most of the land, and there are 99-year leases that the private sector is able to acquire. So people can get a mortgage, but it's on a lease. And when the leases fall due, they revert to the government, and it's then able to issue new leases at a price, of course. And the revenue that it gets from issuing leases is a major part of the revenue base of the government. So it's able to keep taxes low on income and on corporate profits, which makes it an attractive place to do business. Now, land value tax, in a sense, is, without nationalizing land, is a way of replicating some of the features of that system.
Right.
Because as economic growth takes place, land values rise, and then you get an automatic revenue increase that comes from that, which can then be used to provide affordable housing and infrastructure and so on. So I think it's important to keep the comparison with Singapore in mind, because many people don't quite understand. They think, oh, Singapore was just a wonderful example of a low tax system, but it's all because of land actually that is able to keep taxes low.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
glad you brought that up. I mean, that's one example where in the real world, best practice has proven to be quite effective.
exactly. Yeah. Now the prognosis. Well, the world is just so incredibly uncertain with the US uh, behaving in the most unpredictable
Behaving.
way under its leadership,
Perhaps
um,
misbehaving is the better phrase.
misbehaving, the most corrupt government ever. Well, certainly in the 20th century. Um, it's just absolutely astounding. And I mean, where is the Ukraine war going to go? So much of Europe is tied up with these
Yeah.
political problems, which makes it very difficult to think about the economy in the way that we used to think about the economy. I mean, who knows what tariffs are going to do? Who knows whether the US is going to abandon Europe and just leave it to Russia, um, and what the consequences are going to be. I mean, our system of regulation and taxation um, of American um, internet companies um, doesn't play well with Donald Trump. Is he going to demand that we dismantle our entire system of regulation and taxation of multinationals to suit him and his friends? It's just so difficult to figure out what the way forward is going to be. But I think in Europe as a whole, we've had these dramatic rises in interest rates because of the high inflation induced by Ukraine. So there has been a substantial correction in the property market, particularly in the commercial property market for offices and so on. But I think we're more or less through that. Interest rates have come down. So I don't think we're heading for an early crisis. Um, the US situation, obviously, it's an economy of two halves. I mean, there are the tech bros, and AI and the investment that's generating, and then the rest of the economy, which is in a much less good shape. Um, how the dynamics of that works out, it's very hard to see. But I'm interested to hear that you're quite pessimistic.
Well, our public debt has now is fast approaching $40 trillion. It's increasing by $1 trillion every 4 months now.
Yeah.
We have tax reductions on high marginal income levels, um, and we're still spending more and more on military. Um, it's hard to fathom that this can continue without a significant crash. But my focus here in the United States and the research I continue to do is on consumer debt. And I
Yeah.
think to me that's the leading indicator of where we're going in terms of our economy. So I don't know if that plays true for the UK or not.
As student debt is a big component of that, and for young people who are thinking of home ownership, entering the property market, that's become quite a big issue. Right,
Strangely
so
enough, in here in the United States, a good deal of student debt is owed by senior citizens.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
um, I, I suppose again it's the result of grandparents and parents taking out loans to help their children, their young children, make it through higher education. Uh, well,
And,
I would like.
there's one thing we haven't mentioned, which is maybe the most important thing of all, which is the climate crisis. The climate scientists have analyzed the feedback loops in the global climate system, which in some ways, there's some similarities between those and what happened in the global financial crisis and property markets. Um, you know, Lower house prices feed into bigger debt, and bigger defaults, lower house prices, further that kind of dynamic. That's happening in the global climate system, where the reflective power of the ice sheet to reflect back to the sun, the warmth that comes from the sun, the methane that's trapped in the permafrost, that's going to be released by global warming. The dynamics of that are absolutely horrifying. And to have a US president who totally misunderstands, denies that any of this is happening is a complete tragedy for the world. It's probably the most serious issue that our children will be facing in the next 30 years.
If not sooner. If
Well,
not,
if
I
not sooner.
um uh, the last time last in the spring last year when I taught the course I teach on the state of the economy, by the time I reached the end of my lectures, my adult students were totally depressed.
Yes.
And so I decided to end the course with a lecture on innovation
Yeah.
and went out and did the research to show what remarkable discoveries are being made every day, and efforts are being made to solve the environmental crisis problem. Uh, I don't know if it's too late, if we've reached that tipping point. Um, and I saw the same documentary I think you might have seen on the permafrost, the loss of the permafrost in Russia and in Alaska, and I suspect in Greenland. So if Donald Trump succeeds in purchasing or somehow acquiring Greenland, I fear for the future of the permafrost in Greenland. Uh, Wait, I'd like to end our conversation with just a couple questions to you about the future of the alternatives that you put into the paper, into your paper. One regarding to the deferral of tax obligations based on um, uh, income qualification or a needs analysis, and whether or not politically do you think that has potential to be adopted? Because it's something that we've done here in a very limited way, community by community. As the
Yeah.
property tax obligations have gone up, give people an opportunity not to be displaced, but not reap the gains, the unearned gains of the increase in land value.
Yeah, the means testing that you mentioned is part of the reason why the uptake for these deferral schemes across the world has been surprisingly low. And my proposal is for a simple alternative, which is an equity-based deferral, where instead of accumulating debt on the unpaid tax, the tax authority essentially takes an equity stake
Oh,
in the value of the property, that's equivalent to the unpaid tax. And then when the property is sold, it's a fraction of the property value at the sale price then accrues to the tax authority. Um, I'm kind of, I think it's such a neat idea, so simple to operate. It makes deferral so much easier to explain to people. Um, I think it shouldn't be means tested, at least for retired people. Um, it should be offered to every retired person, um, as a way of dealing with this cash flow problem that's always mentioned. When you talk about raising property taxes or bringing in property taxes or reforming property taxes, people with property always say, "What about the poor widow who happens to live in an expensive home? You can't punish her like that." Well, by offering her equity-based deferral, you're not punishing her. She doesn't have to pay any tax at all until the property is eventually sold or transferred to somebody else. So the,
I
the
agree
question,
with you. I think that that's a fair approach. And again, it reduces the incidence of displacement in neighborhoods that are gentrifying, for example.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
so there is some appreciation for that measure here in the United States and in cities that are experiencing rapidly increasing prices in neighborhoods that were once working class neighborhoods.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's a pretty good idea. Um,
I mean, that kind of deferral st doesn't, I mean, one argument against it is that it reduces the incentive to downsize. And downsizing is a good thing because it frees up space for younger families.
no.
But you still preserve a substantial incentive to downsize because as that tax burden builds up, the inheritors will get less and less and less. And they will put pressure on the old lady in the expensive home to move to a smaller place.
Well, there's a sentimentality many people have towards their longtime home and their
Yeah,
neighborhood, etc.
yeah,
And I my personal situation's just been affected by that. I lived in a suburban community for 40 some years. My wife passed away a little over a year ago, and I was there by myself in a 5 bedroom home with almost a half an acre of land to take care of. And common sense immediately struck me. This makes no sense at all to stay here. So I bought a condominium unit that's perfectly fine for me, and I made that house available to a young family with children. So that's, I think somehow we have to give people that incentive to make that common sense decision, um, while obviously accepting the fact that there is a lot of sentimental value to people staying in place until the very end of their lives. Um, so.
well, for you, because property taxes in the US are quite high and related to market value, and the fact that transactions taxes are low, that was a good thing to do. You had the right incentives to do exactly what you did.
I,
In the
I will be
UK,
paying a capital gains tax, however. There's a certain
okay,
level of exemption, but this year I will be paying a capital gains tax on the gain I experienced over,
okay, okay,
even though what the condominium unit I purchased was from the standpoint of a few years ago a high price,
yeah,
but I obtained a high price for the sale of my property. Um,
yeah, yeah,
and I did wonder, I felt sorry for the people that purchased the property and had to pay that much for it, and how much mortgage debt they now are carrying.
yeah,
And so hopefully there's no interruption of income in that household, or those people will probably be in, financial trouble. And that's what I'm looking at in terms of some of the statistics for the United States. What is the average down payment, and what's the effective loan to value ratio that people were carrying on their mortgage loans?
yeah,
And the trend seems to be higher and higher levels of debt per value. So,
yeah,
which brings me to the last issue I'd like to cover with you briefly before we end today, and that is you talk a little bit about co-ops and about community land trusts,
yeah,
and um, and those are two alternatives that exist in the United States. It seems to me, from what I've looked at, that community land trusts are growing in number, if not really in terms of their significant impact on the market. And my real question to you was, uh, based on the need for housing in different parts of the UK, are those models more advantageous to a rural market, or can they be adopted as infill development in major cities?
Right. Very good question.
I have good questions, not very good
Yeah, you got
answers.
you got very good questions. Yeah. There are some rural communities, particularly in desirable locations by the seaside or near beauty spots where the prices are very high. So rural doesn't always mean low price. Um, that said, the key question is, well, at what price can a community land trust acquire the land, which it then permanently owns, and leases out to the people who build homes on it? Um, I think if we had land value taxes, though the price of acquiring that kind of land would be quite a lot lower, and that would make it more feasible for that model to be adopted. Um, Otherwise, it depends on on charities um, uh, or gifts of public land to a community land trust. I mean, that those are not, gifts of publicly owned land to community land trusts. That can be quite a good model um, because it makes permanent the idea that the people who buy homes on that land are doing it not primarily for land speculation reasons, but for a roof over their heads, and having a more widespread attitude that housing is for a community, it's for a roof over your head, it's for living rather than for speculation. Having that more widespread would be a good thing in my view.
Um, it just leads to a short question. Do you have eminent domain procedures in the UK? Or
Um,
do,
you better
or
explain to me what you mean by eminent domain. It's not,
they taking
yeah.
of privately owned land for public purposes, and
Oh, yeah. Okay.
would housing be considered a public purpose?
Okay. We call that compulsory purchase.
Okay.
That's the term. Now, there's a big story around that, which has to do with the compensation that is paid when compulsory purchase is applied. The current government is kind of backsliding on that. They are worried um, about using compulsory purchase powers widely. Many people in the housing field think that those powers should be available to use in a much more freely to prevent holdouts, for example, when land is being assembled for a development. Because you don't want, one bit of one landowner to block a development that involves multiple landowners and extract an extortionate monopoly price for saying yes. You want to be able to compulsory purchase someone like that. So it's a big issue in the UK. The answer is, it's a fluid situation.
And that's a perfect comment for us to end our conversation. And I feel like I've gotten to know you during this conversation, so I hope you'll be okay if I say, John, thank you for joining
Sure.
me. And perhaps we can schedule early next year an update on this conversation to see what has happened during 2026 and how we've responded to it. I'm sure that the listeners of this program would enjoy that update. So to
Let's
conclude,
hope the midterms provide a positive signal for that update.
yeah,
And yeah, thank you very much for
okay.
having me, Ed. It's been great talking to you.
Well, thanks, everyone. This is it for this issue of Smart Talk. For more information, this and other episodes you can find on our website, thehenrygeorgeschool.org. I am Edward Dodson, and thanks again for watching Smart Talk.